former Fulton County District Attorney and Sheriff.
Formerly a judge, and he knows a little bit about how these things go.
From Mohawk Valley, legal eagle, lawman.
He is the Sheriff of Fulton County, New York. Just such an amazing guy.
This is the Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet.
Hey, welcome to today's show, the Rich Giardino Show, where you can catch us on Spotify, X, YouTube, Facebook, Apple, and many other premium platforms for podcasts. Today's program, we're going to discuss two trending cases. One we started discussing months ago. It's the case of the Kentucky sheriff who shot the Kentucky judge. And the second is about President Trump's moving into D.C. and his plans to move into other cities with the National Guard and to head in a direction to reduce crime, make the streets safer. We'll talk about those. I'll start with the Kentucky judge. First and foremost, several months ago, the video aired of the sheriff of a small Kentucky town shooting a county court judge who was his friend and who had worked together with him, and they had had lunch. He shot him in his chambers with several shots as the judge tried to escape, but was pinned in the corner of his office. At the time, they said that the sheriff just snapped and that they had had a discussion at lunch, and they said they would follow up in chambers. There was some speculation that the sheriff had found the judge's phone number on his daughter's phone, or had found texts on his daughter's phone from the judge. What was behind that is there was a pending civil case where a deputy had been arrested, indicted, convicted, and fired and sued for having sex with inmates that were being held in the county court prior to their proceedings or after their proceedings. And that opened up a whole can of worms. We now know the latest that occurred as recently as August. Information came out that the judge himself, other members of law enforcement, and other court lawyers and very prominent people in this rural town were involved in a sexual favors for influence and wild parties, some of which were at the courthouse, some of which were videotaped either with or without the judge's knowledge, and some that were shared. So now it makes more sense when you look in hindsight as to why the sheriff may have snapped if he believed that the judge was trying to lure his own daughter into these. Nothing I read so far and nothing I've researched said that the sheriff himself was involved. There were some indications that a deputy or one or more deputies were involved, but definitely that the motivation was fear for the safety of his daughter from the predator who happened to be a judge, allegedly, in this case. We'll know as the case unfolds, there will either be a plea bargain, and so people listening know that if there was the case that there was sexual abuse involved or the threat of sexual abuse with a minor, the sheriff's child, that could be a mitigating factor. Mitigating means reduces the sentence, or it could be a defense. Problem with as a defense, where it falls is there's no immediacy. And a defense where you allege that he snapped because he thought his daughter was being abused, there'd have to be some immediacy. He would have had to walk in on the judge and caught him with his daughter. He would have had seen a video involving his child or text that made it clear that the judge was trying to line something up for that day. There has to be an immediacy for a defense like that to work. Clearly, this is going to be part of a defense for the sheriff, but until the trial or pretrial hearings, we will not know the extent of it. And that is just the most bizarre case of a sheriff who's good friends with a judge killing him, and it starts to unfold. I had said that there was some sexual component back then. I didn't realize it would be that prominent and that there would be more people involved. But we'll learn a lot more as the case continues to unfold. I ask you to like, share, and subscribe to the Rich Giardino podcast on Apple, YouTube, X, Spotify. Rumble, and other premium podcasting networks. Before we go to my thoughts on D.C. and President Trump's deployment of the National Guard, I'd like to take a moment to share with you my interview with Rich Edson on Fox News. Also with us was Ray Lopez, a local alderman in Chicago. And we talked about the nationalization of the Guard to be used in other high crime cities such as Chicago. I think you'll find this interview interesting.
Cantina owner expresses concern about crime in Chicago as President Trump clashes with Democratic leaders there. He's looking at expanding the crime crackdown to other cities and touts the drop in crime here in Washington, D.C. For more on this, let's welcome Fulton County, New York Sheriff Rich Giardino and Chicago Alderman Raymond Lopez. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Sheriff Rich, I got to ask you, working with federal law enforcement, how does that help local law enforcement? Is the cooperation there really useful to law enforcement?
Well, New York is a different breed. When Andrew Cuomo was governor, he signed a green light bill that does not allow law enforcement on our level to share with ICE and federal agencies if we stop somebody and there may be a warrant for them. And if we stop somebody, we can't share information we get on the computer. So, this problem is nationwide. New York is a bad example. Chicago's similar, but what happened to this country, and I have to take a second to talk about it, is in the 90s, we had an emphasis on victims and victims' rights. And we've lost that in the last 5 years between defund the police, between prosecutors going after police first, and between all the restraints that are put on us in hiring. We nationally have a tremendous problem with recruitment and retention. We do try to work with the feds. One sheriff, a fellow sheriff in upstate New York, had his officers respond to ICE requests for backups, and now the Attorney General is reviewing why they're involved with ICE. So we got to remove the restrictions that are imposed upon us by state government, and we have to have more freedoms to work with the feds. We are all in law enforcement, and frankly, I don't think a person cares who the suspect is that assaults, rapes, beats, or murder a family member. They want us to work together to get them off the street. They don't care if they're an illegal immigrant or a homegrown terrorist, as Stephen said at the White House.
Yeah, Alderman Lopez, the president is looking at expanding this crime crackdown and this federal initiative to your city in Chicago. Here in D.C., polling has showed that people don't really like the National Guard here, but they do overall have concerns about crime in this city. What are the thoughts of your voters in Chicago?
I think absolutely, Rich. Chicagoans want to feel safe in the city of Chicago. They want to know that they can leave their homes and come back safely. They could go to work. They could sit on their front steps, and their kids can go to school without being shot at. I had 2 teenagers shot in my community this weekend alone. So when I hear my Democratic colleagues tell me, don't worry, crime is down, Trump stay home in Washington, I have a real hard time accepting that. And the fact of the matter is that we've always coordinated and cooperated with the federal government and our federal agencies to bring public safety to the streets. We work with the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, and all of a sudden now we don't want to work with them, but we still want their grant money. So there's a serious disconnect in what's going on here on the ground. But overwhelmingly, anything that helps bring peace, as we've saw it bring increased public safety in Washington, D.C. over the past 30 days, they want that here as well.
Sheriff, part of what's going on here in Washington, D.C. is the federal presence is extremely high profile. You have National Guardsmen in all the tourist areas, the National Mall, by Union Station, where people come in. Do you think that helps? Does that help deter crime? Does that help the president's case? Or on the other end of it, do you think that some people might look at it and say, this is a little too heavy-handed, that should be a little more behind the scenes?
Well, traditionally, D.C. is different because it's the District of Columbia, but I think it's a big deterrent to just have the presence of people in uniform on the street. And I'll tell you, I agree with the alderman when he said two children. In 2024, there was a child named Jamani Rivera. In 2022, he's 7 years old. There was an 8-year-old, Melissa Ortega. Both of those were killed in Chicago by drive-by gang shooters. And you don't know, 99% of the people watching this don't know their name, but you say Rodney King or you say George Floyd, everyone knows their name. So the media and not necessarily Fox, but the media, the politicians, and the activists who've got this in their mind that we have to focus on the accused, the defendants, and we're too heavy-handed. They don't understand. We don't police. There's a phrase they use. You're over-policing. We don't over-police. We police to where the crime is. So if that's a minority community, you go in there, and I would bet you, as the statistics show this, the studies show this, that most individuals in Black and Hispanic communities, low economic areas, want responsible law enforcement because they're the victims overwhelmingly. And I think the alderman living in Chicago could verify that. You know, the people on the outskirts who have the police protection in gated communities, they're not complaining because they don't feel it.
All right, guys, we're out of time. Fulton County Sheriff in New York, Rich Giardino, and Chicago Alderman Raymond Lopez, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alderman. It was a pleasure doing the interview with Rich and with Ray Lopez. Now we're going to get back to my thoughts on Washington, D.C. and the deployment of the Guard there. First and foremost, Washington, D.C., where in August the president sent in troops, is a little different than other jurisdictions. Washington, D.C. is not a state. It's a city within the capital city of the country, and there's oversight from the federal government. So the president has much more leeway in sending the National Guard in with or without request under those circumstances. There's been a dramatic decrease in crimes in the first 2 weeks of the federalization. There were no recorded murders. Crime has taken a dip. There was some misreporting saying that people weren't going out to restaurants, but it was an over year. But when you looked at month over month, the reservations were increasing. Restaurants were staying open longer hours and more days. And there was more activity in the inner city, which fulfills what the president said. Crime is hurting the economy and hurting the public safety. One thing we do know, we had John Lott on this program before, and we know that black on black crime has significantly greater consequences to communities and individuals. We know that a large percentage of violent crime is gangs on gangs and drug involvement with illegal firearms. In New York State, I've mentioned this before, I've had a difficult problem in the last 4 years getting any statistics out of Albany that tell us whether a firearm used by a criminal in a violent attempted murder or a murder was lawfully possessed or not lawfully possessed, and whether or not the individual, a felony automatically precludes the use of a weapon or the possession of a weapon. But I can't get the other statistics that would tell us what percentage of those violent crimes are committed with illegal firearms. And that's critical. And that could be illegal because of the nature of the firearm, or it could be stolen, or it could be purchased outside of the state. So those are things of importance. The next question is, does the federalization of troops that the president did in D.C., can that be done in Chicago, Detroit, New York City, and other cities? And in New York City, we saw the governor take the state guard and send them down to New York City to be on the subways and things. One thing that's interesting is a lot of times the National Guard are just assigned to stand around. They are not assigned law enforcement duties. They're not allowed to have their firearms with them. They're not trained in law enforcement. I think it's a dangerous situation to send a guard into an area without giving them firearm access or use. And so you'll see more and more, especially in DC, they've weaponized and allowing them to carry firearms, sidearms in the tasks that they're assigned. An offshoot of this that's very interesting is in New York State, we had the halt protest by prison guards, correction officers, and the governor and the legislature missed the whole point of those. What HALT does is it prevents severe punishment or punishment of extended time to inmates or incarcerated individuals who commit violent crimes against other individuals who are incarcerated or against corrections officers. It limits what can be done as a punishment. Therefore, it cedes and turns the authority of the prison over to the inmates. So they were protesting that they need to have some sanction or punishment to punish those who commit crimes while they're incarcerated. And HALT prevents a lot of those sanctions from being imposed. So the governor in New York then said, we're going to reduce the age to be a correction officer to 18, and we're going to have a continuing presence of National Guard to assist. Both of those are flawed. The National Guard aren't trained to be corrections officers, and 18-year-olds can't even lawfully possess a handgun in this state, let alone do they have the life experience to be in with violent criminals. What they've said is, well, we're going to train them, but we're going to put them with seasoned officers. So that's going to distract the seasoned officer who's going to have to watch the person they're assigned with in addition to performing their duties. So it's a very risky situation. I make an example and a distinction between the president's use of the National Guard federalization for criminal areas. What you will see is you will see some city mayors ask the National Guard to come in. Most of them won't, but as the next month evolves, and we are into September for the airing of this, you're going to see some of the areas the public is going to say, yeah, we'd like them to be available to assist and to have a show of force and threats. We've lost out of 780 to 850,000 police officers that we had 10 years ago. We've dropped down to 600,000 to 650,000. The streets are a lot leaner. People forget that it was Bill Clinton who put 100,000 community police officers on the street. 100,000. And contrary to what the mayor of Chicago said today, or said recently, that, more police doesn't necessarily mean less crime. Well, statistically, more police as a deterrent does mean less crime. And it's very simple. He said, well, housing's a factor. Well, you can build all the apartments or low-income housing you want. But if you go into some of the low-income housing now in major cities, urban cities, there's a lot of violent crime and drug dealing that occurs there. And there's a lot of drive-bys where young children get killed, to the tune of almost 1,000 a year. Young people under the age of 18 and under the age of 17 get killed by gang fires and disruptions. So we'll see how it plays out with President Trump. Again, the media and the Democrats can't give President Trump credit for anything. So you'll never hear them say, yeah, we need that. Yes, crime is out of control. Because if Donald Trump suggests it, it's bad from the beginning because it's Donald Trump. And if you just look at and watch what happens with the policies, not who's presenting them, it's not the messenger. They can't stand that the message comes from Donald Trump. But the majority of the public who live in the crime-ridden areas know the difference. A lot of the wokish individuals say that you over-police the minority areas. You over-police the inner city areas. That's not accurate. We police to where the crime problem is. So while you use the phrase over-police, the actual phrase is policing to where the need is. We're going to send law enforcement to the areas that have the most crime to help to reduce it and to answer the call volume. So that's something the public must understand. It's going to be an interesting 6 months, 4 months, the rest of the year, and then into next year. It'll be very interesting to see how the National Guard plays out, what happens with crime. We do know, and we knew this from John Lott, who was a former guest on one of our podcasts, we know that statistically 6 million to 8 million individuals, populations of 6 to 8 million, do not accurately report the crimes that occur. And therefore it's skewed. So when they say crime is down, well, the reporting of crime may be down. But if you're a family member or you are the victim of a violent crime, a rape, a robbery, a burglary, then that's all you need. That one crime is too much for you. And because it's somebody else's problem, doesn't mean that it's not a problem for all of us. Because if we can't guarantee public safety, all your other rights mean nothing. If you're not safe to walk the streets, if your kids aren't safe at school, if you're not safe going to a concert or a movie, or safe at home, then your other rights really don't matter, because you can't exercise them if you're not safe or feel safe in those environments. So I would argue that's government's first responsibility, is to protect the public. I also, and I've stated this many times before on national TV and on this show, the test should be when the legislature passes a law or seeks to restrict police, what does this do to make the public any safer? What does this do to make law-abiding citizens safer? And if it doesn't, then you shouldn't impose it on the police. The test should be what's making this country safer and what's protecting our citizens and our children and our seniors. You've been listening to the Rich Giardino Show. I ask you to please like, share, and subscribe on X, YouTube, Facebook, and any other premium podcast platform. I'm Rich Giardino, and I thank you for listening.
Like and subscribe to The Rich Giardino Show, part of the Elite Influencer Network, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time on The Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet.